A rusted piece of steel shaped like a cross lies half buried in the sand of Omaha Beach. It looks like a forgotten piece of garbage from a war that has long since moved on. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel planted tens of thousands of these Czech hedgehogs along the coastline to stop American tanks at the water edge. He believed this jagged steel wall would be the ultimate graveyard for the Allied armor. But he never imagined that the very metal he used to build his coastal fortress would become the exact key the Americans used to tear his inland defenses apart. This is not a story about supertanks or top-secret weapons. This is a forensic audit of a mechanical miracle. This is the story of how an American mechanic with a blowtorch and a pile of scrap metal redefined the physical laws of the Normandy battlefield in a matter of days. To understand the scale of this engineering disruption, you must first step into the green hell of the Bocage. If you look at a tactical map of the Normandy Peninsula in the summer of 1944, you do not see a traditional battlefield. You see an ancient and inescapable trap. For more than 2,000 years, Norman farmers had divided their agricultural land into tiny and irregular pastures. They surrounded every single field with solid earthen banks that were up to 10 feet thick at the base and sometimes 8 feet high. Out of these massive dirt walls grew thick and tangled hedges of hawthorn and heavy brambles and ancient oak trees. Over centuries, the roots of these trees wove deeply through the compacted earth. They acted exactly like steel rebar holding heavy concrete together. This was the Bocage. It was a natural fortress that no military academy could have ever designed. The German High Command, and particularly the hardened veterans of the elite 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division, understood exactly what this terrain meant for the invaders. They knew that this specific landscape reduced the overwhelming mobility and numerical advantage of American mechanized forces to absolute zero. The German doctrine in Normandy was built on a simple and brutal premise. Every single enclosed field became an isolated kill box. The American Sherman tank was a formidable machine, but it was fundamentally designed to exploit sweeping breakthroughs on wide-open European plains. It was built for speed and mechanical reliability and unmatched mass production. But in the claustrophobic confines of the Bocage, the Sherman encountered a physical blind spot that no automotive engineer in Detroit had ever anticipated. To advance from one contested field to the next, the American armor had to physically breach the hedgerow. The tank could not simply drive straight through a solid wall of rock-hard packed earth and ancient wooden roots. It had to throttle up and physically climb over the obstacle. This simple requirement created a geometric nightmare for the crew inside. When a 30-ton Sherman drove up the steep earthen bank, the angle of the hull shifted violently upward. Its nose pointed directly into the sky. The 75mm main gun aimed helplessly at the clouds, rendering it completely incapable of laying suppressive fire on the enemy positions ahead. But the loss of offensive firepower was only half of the disaster. The real tragedy occurred at the exact moment the tank crested the top of the bank. As the front tracks lifted into the air, the Sherman exposed its entire underbelly to the opposite side of the field. The belly armor of a Sherman tank was incredibly thin. It measured barely half an inch to 1 inch in thickness. This bottom plate was designed strictly to protect the mechanical linkages and the crew from the shrapnel of small anti-personnel landmines. It was never meant to withstand direct kinetic strikes or the superheated plasma jets of dedicated anti-tank weapons, and waiting patiently in the shadows on the other side of that hedgerow were the German tank hunter teams. They knew the American tanks had no choice but to expose their weakest point. A German infantryman armed with a cheap and disposable Panzerfaust could crouch unseen in the drainage ditch. He did not need a heavy anti-tank gun to destroy the pride of the American armored divisions. He only needed to wait for the exact second the belly of the Sherman pointed toward him. At a range of less than 40 yards, missing was impossible. The shaped charge of the Panzerfaust would easily slice through the thin floor plate like a hot knife through butter. The resulting explosion would instantly ignite the ammunition storage and the high-octane aviation fuel, turning the vehicle into a blazing coffin in less than 3 seconds. This predictable and mechanical execution happened field after field. By early July, the American advance had ground to a bloody and catastrophic halt. The mighty First Army had advanced barely 15 miles inland after 7 weeks of relentless and agonizing combat. The loss rate among the armored battalions was reaching crisis levels. The strategic balance sheet of the Allied forces was bleeding out rapidly. They were not losing the war of attrition to superior German engineering or brilliant operational maneuvering. They were being defeated by a wall of dirt and a few roots. The finest military planners in Washington and London had no tactical solution for this geographical nightmare. They needed a miracle, but miracles do not come from planning committees. In the United States Army, miracles come from the men at the bottom of the hierarchy who are tired of watching their friends die. The crisis in the hedgerows demanded a mechanical intervention. Without a way to push through the earthen bank safely, Operation Cobra, the massive planned breakout from the Normandy beachhead, was doomed to fail. The top-down military structure of the German army believed that the Americans would simply bleed to death against this natural barrier. The German officers trusted their doctrine and their defensive positioning and the unforgiving geometry of the terrain. They assumed that an army built on mass production could not adapt its heavy machinery on the fly. But they fundamentally misunderstood the culture of the soldiers they were fighting. They were fighting an army of mechanics and farmers and factory workers. And in the muddy assembly areas behind the front lines, one of those mechanics was about to change the mathematics of the war. The man who solved the greatest tactical crisis of the Normandy campaign was not an engineer from a prestigious defense contractor. He was a 29-year-old sergeant named Curtis G. Culin. Culin served in the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron. Before the war, he was a cab driver and a mechanic from New Jersey. He understood the basic physics of heavy machinery because he had spent his life working with it. In the first week of July, during a conversation with his fellow soldiers, a simple but radical idea was proposed. Instead of trying to force a 30-ton machine to climb over a solid wall of roots and dirt, why not design a mechanism to slice straight through it? The concept required welding heavy steel teeth to the front transmission housing of the Sherman tank. These teeth would act like the prongs of a fork, digging deep into the compacted earth at the base of the hedgerow. As the tank accelerated, the continuous push of its 400 horsepower Continental engine would force the steel tusks through the dirt and roots. This would anchor the front of the tank, preventing the nose from riding up the bank. The sheer kinetic energy of the 30-ton vehicle would then rip a hole completely through the obstacle. The tracks would remain firmly on the ground. The belly armor would remain perfectly protected. And the 75mm main gun would remain level and ready to fire the exact second the tank breached the other side. It was a brilliant mechanical theory, but a theory on the front lines is utterly useless without the materials to build it. The Allied forces in Normandy were at the end of a massive transatlantic supply chain. They did not have thousands of tons of spare high-grade steel sitting in local depots just waiting to be cut up. They needed a massive source of hardened metal, and they needed it immediately, and this is where the dark irony of the Normandy campaign revealed itself. The Americans found the steel they needed exactly where the Germans had left it. Down on the invasion beaches of Omaha and Utah, the sand was still littered with thousands of heavy steel obstacles. These were the Czech hedgehogs. They had been manufactured by the millions in German factories and planted by the forces of Field Marshal Rommel to tear the bottom out of American landing craft. They were forged from high-quality, thick angle iron. They were designed to withstand the crushing impact of armored barges and the explosive force of artillery shells. They were in short the perfect material for building tank armor. Culin and the maintenance crews of the ordnance battalions drove their trucks back to the beaches. They fired up their acetylene torches and began slicing Rommel's defenses into pieces. This massive decentralized production effort began in the first week of July. For the next 2 weeks, every maintenance battalion in the First Army operated around the clock. In the German army, modifying a weapons platform required authorization from the highest levels of the Waffenamt or Army Ordnance Office. A German mechanic with a good idea had to submit a formal proposal through his commanding officer. That proposal would move slowly up the chain of command to the battalion, then the regiment, then the division. If it survived the bureaucracy, it might reach the engineers in Berlin months later. If approved, it would be integrated into the factory production line the following year. The American system did not wait for the factory. When Sergeant Culin fabricated the first prototype, the testing phase lasted exactly 1 afternoon. He drove a modified light tank directly into a thick Norman bank. The tank smashed through with terrifying ease. General Omar Bradley witnessed the demonstration, looked at the hole in the hedgerow, and issued a single order. He ordered the immediate mass production of the device, utilizing every single arc welder and blowtorch in the First Army. The order triggered a decentralized industrial explosion in the middle of a war zone. Ordnance maintenance companies scattered across the peninsula stopped everything they were doing. They began cannibalizing the German beach defenses around the clock. Sparks flew into the night sky as mechanics worked in continuous 24-hour shifts. The physical labor required to build these devices was staggering. Each Rhino cutter weighed hundreds of pounds. The steel had to be precisely measured and cut using oxyacetylene torches that burned through the thick German iron. The mechanics had to weld these heavy subassemblies directly to the final drive housings of the Sherman tanks. This was a highly sensitive area of the vehicle, containing the transmission and steering gears. A poor weld could shatter under the immense physical impact of hitting a solid earth bank at 10 miles per hour. But these mechanics were not amateur soldiers. They were the industrial working class of the United States. They had spent the Great Depression welding bridges, fixing diesel locomotives, and building skyscrapers. They brought a level of intuitive mechanical literacy to the battlefield that no formal military academy could teach. They did not have standardized factory blueprints. They had rough sketches and word-of-mouth instructions, passed laterally from unit to unit. This lateral spread of information was a defining characteristic of the American military culture. If a solution worked, the men on the ground shared it immediately without waiting for official doctrine to catch up. When the German High Command analyzed the American forces, they often focused on the sheer quantity of the machinery. They respected the industrial output of Detroit and Chicago. But they completely failed to calculate the human capital operating that machinery. They did not realize that the American army was composed of men who viewed a machine not as a permanent limitation, but as a temporary puzzle to be solved with a wrench and a torch. Within a matter of weeks, several hundred Sherman tanks were fitted with the heavy steel prongs. The men began calling them Rhino tanks. The entire operational capability of the American armored forces had been rewritten by a sergeant and a pile of scrap metal. The Rhino was the ultimate manifestation of this cultural divide. It was ugly, it was improvised, it was completely absent from any official technical manual, but it was about to rip the heart out of the German defensive line. And the German defenders, waiting in their carefully prepared kill boxes, had absolutely no idea what was coming. July the 25th, 1944, marked the beginning of Operation Cobra. The American High Command unleashed the most concentrated aerial bombardment in the history of warfare to shatter the German front lines near Saint-Lô. Thousands of heavy bombers turned the landscape into a lunar wasteland of craters and pulverized stone, but as the smoke cleared and the artillery barrages lifted, the surviving German defenders crawled out of their deep dugouts. The men of the elite Fallschirmjäger units shook off the dust and assumed their familiar defensive postures. They checked their weapons and manned the untouched hedgerows that lay just beyond the blast radius. They could hear the deep mechanical roar of American radial engines echoing through the shattered trees. The German squad leaders felt a grim sense of confidence. They had survived the fire from the sky, and now the battle would return to the ground. They believed the physical laws of the bocage had not changed. They knew the American tanks still had to climb over the earthen banks to advance. The German anti-tank teams crouched low in the drainage ditches, gripping their Panzerfausts. They waited for the familiar sequence they had exploited for 7 weeks. They waited for the Sherman to climb the bank and expose its thin belly armor. But the armored vehicles emerging from the smoke did not behave as expected. The Sherman hit the base of the earthen wall with a violent kinetic impact that shook the ground. The heavy steel prongs welded to the transmission housing bit deeply into the dense soil and the thick overlapping roots. The continuous 400 horsepower output of the engine pushed the machine relentlessly forward. The tracks dug into the dirt, preventing the nose of the tank from riding upward. For a fraction of a second, the 2,000-year-old barrier held. Then the physical structure of the hedgerow catastrophically failed. The earthen bank ruptured outward in a massive explosion of dirt and shredded vegetation. The Sherman tore a jagged hole completely through the solid wall and surged into the enclosed pasture. It did not point its main gun uselessly at the clouds. It did not expose its fragile lower hull to the waiting anti-tank weapons. It burst through the barrier perfectly level and entirely lethal. The 75mm cannon and the coaxial machine gun began firing the exact millisecond the tank cleared the breach. The German killbox was instantly transformed into a slaughterhouse for the defenders. The Panzerfaust teams waiting for the belly shot were suddenly staring directly into the thickest frontal armor of a fully operational battle tank. Their ambush geometry had been completely invalidated in less than 5 seconds, and the nightmare for the German infantry had only just begun. Before the Rhino tank had even stopped moving, squads of American riflemen poured through the newly created gap. In the past, the infantry had been forced to climb over the banks separately, leaving them exposed to devastating machine gun crossfire. Now they used the tank as a heavy battering ram to create their own customized doorways through the impregnable terrain. The American riflemen flooded into the field using the massive steel hull of the Sherman as moving cover. They suppressed the German flanks while the tank turret pivoted to annihilate the primary strongpoints. The fundamental mathematics of infantry and armored cooperation had been rewritten over a single weekend. The German defenders were paralyzed by the sudden and violent collapse of their tactical reality. Their officers screamed orders into field telephones, trying to coordinate a defense against a maneuver that was not supposed to be physically possible. The combat reports flowing back to the German headquarters reeked of panic and confusion. Commanders reported that American tanks were somehow driving straight through solid earth walls like ghosts. The highly disciplined German defensive network began to fracture field by field. When a German unit finally managed to disable one of these strange new tanks, they sent their technical intelligence officers forward to investigate. These were men trained to analyze armor thickness, gun caliber, and engine performance. They expected to find a highly classified piece of advanced engineering designed in a secret laboratory in Washington. Instead, they looked at the front of the destroyed Sherman and found a crude heavy steel bracket welded directly to the hull. As the German engineers brushed the mud off the metal prongs, the metallurgical irony of the situation struck them with devastating force. They recognized the specific angle and thickness of the steel. They realized they were looking at the exact same metal that Field Marshal Rommel had ordered, placed on the Normandy beaches to drown the American invasion force. The Americans had not invented a sophisticated new technology to break the bocage. They had simply taken the German defensive architecture, melted it down, and turned it into the very teeth that were now eating the German army alive. This revelation was deeply unsettling to the German officer corps. It represented a type of warfare that their rigid top-down system could neither anticipate nor replicate. If a German soldier had suggested cutting up beach defenses to weld onto a panzer, it would have triggered a massive bureaucratic review. The concept would have been debated by engineers, delayed by material shortages, and ultimately discarded as non-standard equipment. But the American Army did not care about standardization when it was losing a battle. They cared about keeping their men alive and moving the front line forward. The decentralized genius of the American mechanic had bypassed the entire strategic calculus of the German high command. The Rhino tanks multiplied across the battlefield like a mechanical virus. Every day more maintenance companies ripped up more beach obstacles and welded more tusks onto more tanks. The enclosed pastures that had served as the ultimate German fortress for 2 agonizing months were now being systematically dissected. The breakout that the Allies had desperately sought was finally gaining irreversible momentum. The psychological impact on the German 3rd Parachute Division was immediate and devastating. For weeks, they had relied on the absolute predictability of the American armored tactics. They knew exactly where the Sherman would appear and exactly where its armor was weakest. But the introduction of the Culin Hedgerow Cutter destroyed this tactical mathematical equation. Imagine the terror of a German anti-tank gunner crouching in the damp earth of a Norman ditch. He hears the approaching roar of the Continental radial engine. He waits for the nose of the tank to pitch upward against the sky. He waits for the fragile underbelly to expose itself to his weapon. But the nose never rises. Instead, the entire earthen wall directly in front of him explodes outward in a shower of roots and pulverized rock. Through the blinding dust and flying debris, the massive steel hull of the Sherman emerges completely level. The coaxial machine gun is already firing before the dust even begins to settle. The 75mm cannon is already tracking its target. The hunters had instantly become the hunted. This was not just a minor tactical inconvenience for the German high command. This was the complete structural failure of their primary defensive strategy in Western Europe. When German field commanders began receiving the frantic reports from the front lines, they struggled to comprehend the mechanical reality of what was happening. The report stated that American tanks were simply driving through the ancient earthen banks as if they were made of paper. To an officer trained in the rigid and highly structured environment of the Prussian military tradition, this sounded like mass hysteria. Tanks do not drive through solid earth. It violates the known laws of mechanical physics and vehicular limitations. But when the German forces finally managed to knock out one of these advancing Shermans and sent their technical officers to inspect the wreckage, the truth was even more insulting. The German engineers expected to find a sophisticated new hydraulic ram or a top-secret transmission system developed by the finest minds at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. What they found was a crude and ugly set of steel teeth welded hastily to the front of the vehicle. They analyzed the metallurgical composition of the heavy steel prongs. They realized with absolute horror that they were looking at their own coastal defense obstacles. The Americans had not out-engineered the German war machine. They had simply scavenged the German war machine and turned its own metal against it. This specific detail highlights the profound cultural difference between the two opposing armies. The German military apparatus produced technological masterpieces like the Panther and the Tiger, but their rigid top-down system could not adapt at the speed required by battlefield reality. The American army was different. It was an army of tinkerers who solved practical problems with whatever tools they had at hand. When General Bradley saw the Rhino prototype work, he did not wait for approval from Washington. He essentially ordered the creation of a massive decentralized factory system right in the middle of the combat zone. Maintenance battalions were transformed into heavy manufacturing plants. Welders worked until their eyes burned and their hands blistered. They did not have technical blueprints or standardized schematics. They had a basic idea and they adapted it to whatever materials they could find. Some units used the Czech hedgehogs from the beaches. Others used salvaged steel beams from bombed-out French railway stations. Some even cannibalized the armor plating from destroyed German tanks to forge the cutting teeth. The forensic examination of the welds on these captured Rhino tanks revealed a fascinating story of battlefield desperation. The American mechanics did not have the luxury of clean workshops or precision jigs. They were welding heavy steel to cast armor in the pouring rain while artillery shells detonated in the distance. The weld beads were thick and ugly and rushed, but they possessed an immense structural integrity. The mechanics understood that the entire force of a 30-ton vehicle hitting a solid wall at 10 miles per hour would be concentrated on those specific joints. If the welds snapped, the tank would smash its nose into the dirt and become instantly vulnerable. So they layered the welds and reinforced the stress points with whatever scrap metal they could scavenge. This was blue-collar engineering applied to a lethal strategic problem, and it worked with a brutal and unforgiving efficiency. This lateral spread of innovation was impossible for the German army to counter. Within a matter of 2 weeks, hundreds of American tanks had been transformed into these heavily MOVI-breaching vehicles. The American armored divisions were no longer confined to the narrow and predictable roads. They could now maneuver across the landscape with terrifying unpredictability. They carved their own roads through the ancient pastures. The German defensive lines were systematically bypassed, outflanked, and annihilated. The intricate kill boxes that had held the Allied armies at bay for nearly 2 months were completely dismantled. The German infantrymen who survived these initial encounters described a battlefield that had suddenly gone insane. They could no longer trust the earth beneath their feet or the walls around them. The psychological security of the Bocage had been completely shattered. Every rustling leaf and every snapping branch could signify the arrival of 30 tons of modified American steel. Operation Cobra accelerated from a grinding battle of attrition into a full-scale mechanized breakout. The German 7th Army found itself trapped in a collapsing pocket of its own making. The very terrain they had relied upon to protect them was now acting as a cage while the American armor sliced through the walls. The natural fortress of Normandy had been unlocked by an American mechanic holding an acetylene torch. Let us conduct a final forensic audit of the Normandy campaign to understand the true scale of this mechanical disruption. In the 7 agonizing weeks preceding the widespread adoption of the Culin Hedgerow Cutter, the American forces had suffered catastrophic losses for minimal territorial gain. The First Army had bled thousands of men and lost hundreds of irreplaceable armored vehicles just to advance a few miserable miles. The logistics network was straining under the constant and terrifying demand for replacement tanks and fresh crews. The German defense in the Bocage had proven to be highly efficient and mathematically predictable. They traded space for blood at an exchange rate that heavily favored the defenders. But let us examine the strategic balance sheet immediately after the introduction of the Rhino modification. Within 72 hours of Operation Cobra, commencing on July 25th, the static war of attrition had completely evaporated. The American armored columns advanced further in 3 days than they had in the previous 2 agonizing months. The German 7th Army was not just defeated in the field, but systematically dismantled and eventually encircled in the Falaise pocket. Once the American tanks broke free from the hedgerow kill boxes, they pushed the German infantry out into the open roads. Without the protective cover of the ancient routes, the retreating German columns were mercilessly annihilated by Allied tactical air power. Over 50,000 German soldiers were captured and 10,000 were killed in the subsequent collapse of the Normandy front. The impregnable natural fortress of the Bocage had been turned into a massive death trap for its own defenders. This dramatic reversal of fortune forces a harsh historical verdict on the opposing military philosophies. When we analyze the machinery of the Second World War, we often fetishize the precision of German engineering. We study the overlapping road wheels of the Panther tank and the terrifying muzzle velocity of the 88mm anti-aircraft gun. The German military-industrial complex produced machines of uncompromising quality and terrifying lethality, designed by brilliant minds at Krupp and Henschel. But they built a rigid system that required absolute perfection from the top down. If a tactical problem emerged on the battlefield that the elite engineers in Berlin had not anticipated, the German frontline units had no institutional mechanism to solve it quickly. The American military machine operated on an entirely different and far more pragmatic philosophy of war. The Sherman tank was not a perfect machine by any metric. It was undergunned and under-armored compared to its heavier German counterparts, but it was mechanically reliable, highly standardized, and designed to be repaired in the mud by 19-year-old farm boys. The United States won the Second World War not just through overwhelming industrial volume, but through this lateral battlefield innovation. The American command structure possessed the flexibility to allow a lowly sergeant from New Jersey to identify a fatal flaw and propose a ridiculous-looking solution. It allowed a high-ranking general to authorize the mass production of that solution without a single bureaucratic review or safety committee. It trusted the mechanics at the bottom of the military hierarchy to rewrite the tactical manual with a welding torch and a pile of scrap metal. The sheer volume of welding rods and acetylene gas consumed by the American Ordnance battalions in those 2 weeks was staggering. It was a massive decentralized industrial operation disguised as a military deployment. This was the ultimate triumph of a flexible logistics system over a rigid and uncompromising military ideology. However, we must never forget that every mechanical innovation in warfare is ultimately paid for in human blood. The Rhino tanks saved thousands of American lives during the violent breakout from the Normandy beachhead, but the brilliant man who invented the device did not escape the brutal mathematics of the conflict. A few months after the roaring success of Operation Cobra, Sergeant Curtis Culin was severely wounded in combat. In November of 1944, he was hit during heavy fighting in the autumn campaign. He survived the war and eventually returned to his civilian life in the United States, carrying the permanent physical scars of the conflict. He received the prestigious Legion of Merit for his exceptional service and contribution to the Normandy campaign. But his personal tragedy is a stark reminder that even the most brilliant tactical solutions do not erase the heavy human cost of the conflict. Behind every tank, every weapon system, and every piece of rusted battlefield debris, there is a human being who paid the ultimate price for the victory. The history of the Second World War is not just a ledger of steel production and fuel consumption. It is a terrifying ledger of flesh and bone and shattered lives that must never be forgotten. Thank you for joining this forensic audit of the Normandy Breakout. If this deep dive into the mechanical realities of the battlefield changed your perspective on the campaign, please leave a like on this video. I want to hear your thoughts and theories in the comments section below. Do you think the German army could have ever replicated this kind of bottom-up innovation if they had the resources? Or was their rigid top-down hierarchy the true root cause of their eventual downfall? If you have family members who served in the armoured divisions or the ordnance maintenance battalions during the war, please share their stories. Their sacrifices and their ingenuity deserve to be recorded and remembered by the next generation. Do not forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next historical investigation. Field Marshal Rommel used thousands of tons of high-grade steel to build an impenetrable wall to keep the Americans out of Europe. The Americans simply picked up that steel and handed it back to him.